Ask a Vietnam veteran what threatened them most in the jungle, and the answers usually follow a familiar path. Ambushes, booby traps, snipers hidden in tree lines. The constant tension of not knowing where the next shot would come from. But if you let the conversation continue, if you listen past the expected memories, another category of threat begins to surface. Smaller, quieter, relentless. The insects. Vietnam was not just a battlefield. It was a living ecosystem that never stopped pressing against the men inside it. Heat, humidity, vegetation, and standing water combined to create perfect conditions for insects of every kind. They crawled, bit, stung, swarmed, and fed without pause. They did not recognize uniforms, rank, or mission objectives. They attacked when soldiers slept, when they moved, and when they believed they were finally safe. For many U.S. soldiers, insects were not an inconvenience. They were a constant source of injury, disease, and psychological strain. In some cases, they removed more men from the field than enemy fire. Medical records from the war make this clear, but statistics alone do not capture what it felt like to live under that constant assault. To understand the insect threat in Vietnam, it is necessary to understand the environment first. Vietnam's climate worked against the human body. Monsoon rains soaked the land for months at a time, creating endless pools of stagnant water. Rice paddies stretched across entire regions, warm and shallow, ideal breeding grounds for insects. Drainage was poor. Trails turned into mud. Fire bases became islands surrounded by moisture. Even during dry seasons, humidity clung to everything, preventing skin and clothing from fully drying. American soldiers lived inside this environment. Their presence made it worse. Footprints filled with water. Shell craters collected rain. Discarded cans, tarps, and equipment created new breeding sites. Camps that were meant to provide safety instead became magnets for insects. Where humans gathered, insects followed. Among all of these threats, mosquitoes stood above the rest. Not because of the pain of their bites, but because of what they carried. In Vietnam, mosquitoes were the most dangerous insects U.S. soldiers faced, responsible for widespread disease, repeated hospitalizations, and long-term health consequences. Mosquitoes were everywhere. They emerged from standing water at dusk and remained active through the night. Soldiers described clouds so thick they darkened lantern light. The high-pitched whine near the ear became one of the most hated sounds of the war. Sleep was rarely uninterrupted. Stillness invited bites. Movement offered only temporary relief. Mosquito nets were issued, but they tore easily and were difficult to use during patrols or in temporary positions. Repellent helped, but only briefly. Sweat washed it away. Some repellents irritated skin, already weakened by heat and moisture. Soldiers used them anyway, knowing it was better than nothing. But mosquitoes adapted. They found uncovered skin, ankles, wrists, faces, necklines. The bites themselves were only the beginning. What made mosquitoes deadly in Vietnam was malaria. The disease spread quietly and efficiently through mosquito populations, infecting soldiers without warning. A man could be bitten dozens of times in a single night and never know which bite carried the parasite. Malaria symptoms often appeared days or weeks later. Early signs were easy to dismiss. Headaches, muscle aches, fatigue. Symptoms soldiers already experienced from heat, stress, and lack of sleep. Then came the chills. Violent, uncontrollable shaking that left men wrapped in ponchos despite tropical heat. Fever followed, sometimes rising so fast that soldiers became disoriented or collapsed. Medical personnel recognized malaria immediately. It was so common that it became part of daily operations. Preventive medication was issued, but compliance was inconsistent. Pills caused side effects. Some soldiers forgot doses during long patrols. Others lost them with gear. Even when taken correctly, prevention was not guaranteed. Malaria did not always strike once and pass. Some strains lingered in the body, returning weeks or months later. Soldiers who had already endured one episode found themselves sick again, sometimes worse than before. Repeated fevers weakened the body, drained strength, and slowed recovery. A man who looked uninjured could suddenly become incapable of carrying his load or keeping pace with his unit. Hospitalization rates tell part of the story. Malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses sent thousands of U.S. soldiers to field hospitals during the war. In some units, disease caused more evacuations than combat wounds. Helicopters lifted men out who had not been shot, not been wounded by shrapnel, but who could no longer function because of illness. This had a direct impact on operations. A soldier removed from the field meant a missing rifle, a missing radio operator, a missing medic. Units had to redistribute gear and responsibilities. Patrols slowed. Missions were delayed or altered. The enemy did not need to fire a shot to weaken a unit. The environment did that work quietly. The psychological impact was just as severe. Mosquitoes made rest feel impossible. Soldiers learned to associate stillness with vulnerability. Even inside secured perimeters, the insects found their way in. Bunkers, tents, foxholes, and helicopters offered no real protection. Mosquitoes followed soldiers everywhere, reinforcing the sense that Vietnam itself was hostile. Veterans later described how the constant presence of mosquitoes eroded morale. There was no way to fight back effectively. You could not shoot them. You could not clear them out. You could only endure. That sense of helplessness wore on men already under extreme stress. For many soldiers, malaria became a defining part of their Vietnam experience, not because it was dramatic, but because it was relentless. It removed control. It punished the body without warning. It reminded soldiers that survival depended not only on tactics and training, but on biology and chance. Mosquitoes did not care about courage or discipline. They fed when they could and moved on. But the consequences remained. Some soldiers carried the effects of malaria long after leaving Vietnam. Recurring illness, chronic fatigue, sensitivity to heat. Even decades later, veterans could recall the feeling of shaking chills and the exhaustion that followed. Understanding the role of mosquitoes in Vietnam helps explain why veterans often describe the war as exhausting in ways that go beyond combat. It was not just the fighting. It was the constant pressure of the environment. The knowledge that even in moments of rest, the body was under attack. And mosquitoes were only the beginning. The jungle housed countless other insects that bit, stung, and swarmed, each adding its own layer of danger and discomfort. Giant centipedes crawled into boots and sleeping bags. Ants attacked in waves. Scorpions hid in gear. Horseflies and wasps delivered painful stings during moments of weakness. Together, these insects formed an invisible front in the Vietnam War, one that never slept, one that never retreated, one that wore soldiers down day after day. This was not a war fought only against an enemy force. It was a war fought against the environment itself. And for U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, insects were among the most persistent and dangerous enemies they faced. If mosquitoes represented an invisible, lingering enemy, other insects in Vietnam confronted soldiers in far more immediate and visceral ways. These encounters were sudden, painful, and often terrifying, not because they were fatal, but because they violated the last places where soldiers believed they had some measure of control. Boots, sleeping, bags, tunnels, gear. The giant centipede and the weaver ant turned moments of rest into moments of shock. Among the most feared arthropods encountered by U.S. soldiers were giant centipedes. These creatures thrived in Vietnam's damp soil, rotting vegetation, and underground spaces. Soldiers encountered them in jungles, base perimeters, bunkers, and tunnel systems. They were fast, aggressive when disturbed, and capable of delivering bites that veterans remembered decades later. Giant centipedes in Vietnam grew far larger than what most American soldiers had ever seen before. Thick-bodied, brightly colored, and highly flexible, They moved with unsettling speed. Their many legs allowed them to cling to surfaces, crawl vertically, and wedge themselves into narrow spaces. Darkness and moisture made perfect hiding conditions, and American deer provided endless shelter. Encounters often began without warning. A soldier reaching into a boot, another unrolling a sleeping bag, a hand bracing against a sandbag wall. The centipede struck defensively, its venom causing immediate and intense pain. Veterans described the sensation as being stabbed with a burning needle or shocked with electricity. The pain was not dull or gradual. It was instant and overwhelming. Swelling followed quickly. The bitten area often became rigid and discolored. Muscles tightened involuntarily. Fingers curled. Limbs shook. In some cases, soldiers were temporarily unable to use the affected hand or leg. Although centipede bites were rarely fatal, they caused significant injury and removed soldiers from duty for days or weeks. Medical treatment in the field was limited. Medics cleaned the wound, monitored swelling, and administered pain relief when available. Infection was a serious concern. Vietnam's humidity and constant exposure to dirt meant even small wounds could become dangerous. Soldiers bitten near joints often experienced prolonged stiffness or numbness that interfered with their duties long after the pain subsided. Tunnels were especially dangerous. Soldiers tasked with tunnel clearing faced not only enemy combatants, but also an ecosystem adapted to darkness. Centipedes thrived underground. Crawling through narrow spaces, soldiers disturbed creatures that had nowhere to flee. Bites in tunnels were particularly frightening, as pain and muscle spasms could cause panic in confined spaces. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers learned that danger could come from within their own equipment. Boots were shaken violently before being worn. Sleeping bags were checked repeatedly. Helmets were inspected. Even then, centipedes still found their way inside. The sense of vulnerability never fully faded. If giant centipedes inspired fear through sudden pain, weaver ants created chaos through sheer numbers. Known by U.S. soldiers as communist ants, these red ants were aggressive, territorial, and seemingly immune to deterrence. They lived in massive colonies, building nests in trees, brush, and along jungle paths. Disturbing a weaver ant colony triggered an immediate response. Ants poured out in swarms, biting simultaneously. Soldiers described being covered within seconds. The bites were intensely painful, producing a sharp burning sensation that lingered long after the ants were removed. Unlike mosquitoes or centipedes, weaver ants attacked in mass. Repellent had little effect on them. Smoke offered limited relief. Soldiers caught in an ant swarm often had to abandon positions, strip off gear, and physically brush the ants away. In combat situations, this was not always possible. Weaver ant attacks sometimes occurred during patrol halts, ambush setups, or while occupying temporary defensive positions. Ants targeted soft tissue, neck, groin, armpits, inside clothing. They bit repeatedly, clinging with their mandibles. The pain was distracting enough to break concentration, and in extreme cases, soldiers panicked. Leaders had to account for ant colonies when selecting patrol routes and rest areas. Medical consequences followed. Multiple bites caused swelling and skin irritation. Scratching led to infection. Soldiers already weakened by heat or illness suffered additional stress. While ant bites were rarely life-threatening, their cumulative effect contributed to exhaustion and lowered morale. The unpredictability made them worse. A position that seemed safe could erupt in seconds. Soldiers learned to scan the ground and trees, not only for enemy movement, but for insect nests. The jungle demanded constant attention, and ants ensured that even moments of stillness carried risk. Together, centipedes and weaver ants reinforced a brutal lesson. Vietnam offered no truly safe spaces. The ground, the trees, the gear, and the darkness all belonged to the environment first. Soldiers were guests in a system that reacted violently to intrusion. Veterans later reflected that these encounters blurred the line between combat and survival. Pain did not always come from bullets. Fear did not always come from enemy movement. Sometimes it came from the realization that the body itself could be overwhelmed by creatures far smaller than a human. These insects did not change the course of battles, but they changed the daily experience of war. They shaped habits, heightened anxiety, and contributed to the sense that Vietnam was relentless. The environment did not rest, and neither could the men inside it. By the midpoint of their tours, many soldiers had internalized this reality. Shake everything. Check everything. Trust nothing. Every movement carried consequence. Every moment of rest required vigilance. And still, there were more threats waiting. Fire ants, red ants, scorpions, horseflies, and wasps remained part of daily life. They stung wounded men. They attacked during exhaustion. They added pain to already strained bodies. These creatures may not have been as infamous as mosquitoes or as shocking as centipedes, but they completed the picture. Vietnam's insect threat was not defined by a single species. It was defined by accumulation, pain layered on pain, stress layered on stress, day after day, bite after bite. Understanding these experiences explains why veterans often describe the war as invasive, not just something that happened around them, but something that got inside their skin, their habits, their memories. And the list was not finished yet. While mosquitoes weakened soldiers from within, and centipedes and weaver ants delivered sudden, shocking pain, other insects in Vietnam completed the daily erosion of the body. Fire ants, red ants, scorpions, horseflies, and wasps rarely made headlines, but they were ever present. They stung wounded men, attacked when soldiers were exhausted, and ensured that even minor injuries became lasting problems. Their danger lay not in rarity, but in persistence. Fire ants and red ants were especially common around base perimeters, patrol routes, and rest areas. They thrived in disturbed ground, exactly the kind created by digging fighting positions, building fire bases, and clearing landing zones. Soldiers learned quickly that kneeling, sitting, or lying down without checking the ground could result in dozens of stings within seconds. Fire ant stings were intensely painful, producing burning sensations that lingered long after the insects were brushed away. Red ants behaved similarly, swarming exposed skin and climbing rapidly inside clothing. Soldiers described moments when they suddenly felt pain spreading across their legs or back, only to realize they were standing or lying on an active nest. These attacks were not always avoidable. During firefights, ambushes, or long patrol halts, soldiers could not always move immediately. Wounded men were particularly vulnerable. A soldier hit by shrapnel or bullets might be forced to remain still while ants crawled over exposed skin, biting repeatedly. Medics sometimes had to brush ants away while treating injuries, adding stress to already chaotic situations. The physical effects of ant stings compounded existing problems. Swelling, itching, and irritation encouraged scratching. In Vietnam's humid environment, broken skin quickly became infected. What might have been a minor irritation elsewhere could turn into an open sore that refused to heal. Soldiers already dealing with jungle rot, blisters, or insect bites found their bodies increasingly overwhelmed. Scorpions added another layer of threat, especially inside bunkers, hooches, and gear. These nocturnal creatures sought shelter in boots, helmets, sleeping bags, and equipment left on the ground. Their presence was rarely detected until a soldier was stung. Scorpion stings caused sharp, immediate pain and localized swelling. While rarely fatal, they were deeply unsettling. The psychological impact of scorpions mirrored that of centipedes. Soldiers learned their own gear could betray them. Boots were shaken violently. Helmets were checked. Sleeping areas were inspected repeatedly. Even with precautions, scorpions still found their way inside. The sense that nothing could be trusted never fully faded. Horseflies and wasps brought a different kind of misery. Horseflies were large, aggressive, and persistent. Their bites were painful enough to draw blood, and they often targeted exposed areas like necks, arms, and faces. Unlike mosquitoes, horseflies bit during daylight hours, adding to discomfort during patrols and work details. Wasps posed a particular danger around base camps and cleared areas. Disturbing a nest could result in multiple stings in seconds. Soldiers described moments when patrols were forced to scatter after accidentally triggering a wasp nest. The pain was sharp and immediate, and in rare cases, allergic reactions caused serious medical emergencies. These insects rarely removed soldiers from the war by themselves. Instead, they wore men down gradually. Each sting added stress. Each bite added irritation. Each infection added weakness. The cumulative effect was significant. Soldiers lived in a state of constant physical discomfort that drained energy and morale. Medical personnel saw this erosion daily. They treated infected bites, swollen limbs, and allergic reactions alongside combat wounds. Supplies were limited. Clean conditions were rare. Medics did what they could, but often treatment meant little more than preventing problems from becoming worse. Recovery was slow, and recurrence was common. What made these insects particularly dangerous was timing. They struck when soldiers were already exhausted. After long patrols, during night watches, while sleeping, when the body was least prepared to respond. There was no safe window, no predictable pattern. Pain and irritation became part of the background of daily life. Veterans later described how these constant minor assaults changed their relationship with their own bodies. They stopped expecting comfort. They stopped expecting full recovery. Pain became normal. Swelling became normal. Itching became normal. Soldiers learned to function despite discomfort, not because it was manageable, but because there was no alternative. The psychological toll was cumulative. Insects reinforced the sense that Vietnam was an environment designed to break the human body. The jungle did not attack all at once. It wore men down slowly, exploiting every weakness. Fatigue lowered awareness. Lowered awareness increased exposure. Exposure increased injury. The cycle fed itself. Fire ants, scorpions, horseflies, and wasps may not have carried the same long-term disease burden as mosquitoes, but they completed the picture of an environment that offered no relief. Even when enemy contact was light, the jungle ensured that soldiers never truly rested. Veterans often said that the worst part was not the pain itself, but the lack of escape. Insects were inside the wire, inside the bunkers, inside the gear, inside the sleeping bags. There was no front line separating danger from safety. The war followed soldiers everywhere. Over time, these experiences shaped habits that lasted long after the war ended. Veterans described checking boots years later, shaking out bedding, reacting instantly to crawling sensations. These behaviors were not conscious choices. They were learned responses, shaped by months of exposure to an environment where small threats had serious consequences. Medical records capture some of this story. Infection rates, treatment notes, evacuation statistics, but they cannot capture what it felt like to live with constant irritation, pain, and anxiety. They cannot capture the exhaustion of knowing that even rest came with consequences. For many veterans, these insects symbolize the nature of the Vietnam War itself. Not clean, not orderly, not contained. It was a war fought in mud, heat, and humidity, against an enemy that blended into the environment, and against an environment that fought back. The 5 insect threats faced by U.S. soldiers in Vietnam did not operate in isolation. Mosquitoes weakened bodies with disease. Centipedes delivered shocking pain. Ants attacked in waves. Scorpions hid in gear. Horseflies and wasps punished exposed skin. Together, they formed a constant, low-level assault that never stopped. This assault shaped how soldiers moved, slept, and thought. It shaped how they understood danger. It taught them that survival required vigilance, not only against enemy forces, but against nature itself. The jungle was alive, and it reacted violently to intrusion. If you are a veteran watching this, none of this will sound unfamiliar. You lived it. You felt it. You learned to endure it. These experiences mattered, even if they were never written into official histories or commemorated in medals. For everyone else, understanding these insect threats is part of understanding the real Vietnam War. Not just the battles, but the conditions. Not just the strategy, but the survival. War was fought not only with weapons, but with endurance against an environment that attacked constantly and without mercy. Vietnam was not just a place where soldiers faced an opposing army. It was a place where the land, the climate, and the smallest creatures became enemies. And for U.S. soldiers, surviving meant enduring all of it, day after day, bite after bite, until they could finally leave.